AI in HE. What the hell is going on? We discussed a few titles for today's conversation, but settled on this like outcry of bewilderment that captures the anxieties and frustrations of many conversations that we've had in this forum, but also, in classrooms with students and meetings with colleagues. And I can't think of a better person to have along today to try and think through how we navigate all of these challenges posed by the integration of AI into teaching, learning, research, admin, all of our day-to-day activities. Dr. Mark Carrigan is Senior Lecturer in Education at the University of Manchester, where he co-leads the Digital Education Manchester Group. And he's a prolific writer of loads of fascinating books, including Social Media for Academics, The Public and Their Platforms, most recently, Platform and Agency, Becoming Who We Are. I also saw in a post this morning, just about an hour ago or so, that you almost completing two new monographs. I don't know how you do it, but the most pertinent for today's chat is his 2024 book, Generative AI for Academics, and a recent study, Teacher Agency and Generative Artificial Intelligence, for the journal Learning, Media and Technology. There's so many questions. Sorry. A bit of a frog in my throat. There's so many questions I've got for Mark, and I'm sure everyone else does too. So I'm going to jump straight into it. And Mark, thanks so much for being with us today. I wanted to start by asking you on your current reading of the state of debates. I'm just going to close this so that we can now see each other. In your book, you talked about these debates often becoming, I think you said, short-sighted and polarized into camps of like optimists and pessimists. And I think we do see that happening today when you've got university leadership on the one hand embracing AI and signing these big contracts with big tech firms, but on the other hand, we see groups of scholars referring to degenerative AI and the plagiarism machine and signing open letters warning about the risks for research and teaching. Do you think debates are as polarized as this, or are there more nuanced conversations happening that you're witnessing in the field right now?
It's really polarized. I spent Tuesday at the Wonky conference in London on AI, and honestly, I slightly regretted it because I sat through an entire event about AI in higher education where at no point did anyone seriously consider the fact this might be something fundamentally harmful or that it might be something that we don't have to just simply adapt to. And there was a conference Discord, and despite not really using social media anymore, it took me back to kind of the good old days of Twitter at conferences, and I was just channeling my frustration into it until I realized that I was really annoying half the room. A few people were DMing me saying, "Thank you for saying this." But I found it interesting because in some spaces I feel I am positioned as the AI advocate. In that space, my God, I felt I was the AI critic. And until people DM me, I felt I was the only critic in the room. And I've had the experience over the last couple of years of one occasion, I literally gave the same talk, same slides. The delivery might have slightly shifted between the audiences. One day I was told that I was being too critical. The next day I was told I was not being critical enough. And there's something self-indulgently satisfying about that, but I think it does kind of point to the sense that optimism and pessimism doesn't really grapple with the complexity of the issues. And I found the rollout of ChatGPT a really strange experience just because a lot of people I was used to sharing the same instincts with were responding to it very differently to me. And I think that might have been over the last 5 years at Manchester when I led an educational technology program. I kind of become a technologist as well as a sociologist at this stage. And, for me, that's a difference of frame. So we can look at the technology and just think, well, what is this? What can we do with it? And you hold features of the context static while you're having that kind of conversation. And it's on that level that, like, fairly early on, I thought, like, this is amazing. Like, this is really fascinating what this can do. And it made it strange to then realize that other people were immediately jumping to the worst conclusions. And like I felt quite polarized in my responses by that. And it's over time that I started to think that the kind of AI critics were clearly right, but I think they got the timescale wrong. And I think some of the nuances of the argument were wrong. And there was a kind of wrong course a lot of AI criticism went on from my perspective, which is seeking to explain away the capabilities of the technology. It was very comforting to reduce it to a technical object and say this is just autocomplete on steroids or this is just a stochastic parrot. And I think a critical approach to AI means that we have to grapple with the fact that like this is a really quite astonishing technology, and the speed at which it's developed, and more recently, if people in the room haven't tried Claude Code, Claude Cowork, or OpenAI Codex, I'd really recommend it because it's genuinely unsettling to have a team of agents running autonomously in the background while you're doing something else. And unless we grapple with the capability of the models, I don't think we can have an adequate account of their harms. So I get to the point now where I use them regularly. I am restricting my use in certain ways. I feel guilty about it, but I find it very hard to go back. But I also agree with a lot of critics that this is heading in a really destructive direction. I just place the emphasis on the model of commercialization and the economics of the sectors in which it's being taken up as much as the technology itself. I mean, it's a trite point, but I think we could have had slightly different LLMs that were less prone to generating these harms. But unfortunately, they emerged in a kind of post-pandemic economic context, which brings the worst out of everything. And so, to get back to your core question, I think there is a kind of optimism, pessimism, where people are positioned as being pro AI or anti AI. And I think that's really unhelpful. I think the technology is fascinating. I think the commercial model is destructive. And I think partly because of these dichotomies, it's really hard for us to have a serious conversation about what to do. I think the level of AI discourse in higher education is really weak in a lot of ways.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that polarization, I think, makes it really difficult to have open conversations, like candid conversations about what we're doing, and I think that's something that you call for in the book as well, like for us to have more transparent practice, right? To have these like open conversations with one another, and also like I guess another key argument that you make is for us to challenge the way that AI is marketed and to sort of see them uh, not as tools for increasing our productivity that can undertake tasks on our behalf, but as these conversational agents, that we have conversations with and like interlocutors, I think you use the term, and we have these reflexive interactions with, so we talk to them and then reflect on what it is that we're getting back from our prompt. So we don't delegate our thinking or work into AI, but discuss thoughts and plans with it instead. And when I read this, I thought that it was kind of like you were calling on us as scholars to shape our own technical habits before they get imposed on us, by some frameworks of how we should use it. So yeah, can you tell us a bit about that argument about orientating academics to AI, and how much agency do we have in shaping our orientations to these technologies, you think?
Yeah, that's a question I've spent a lot of time preoccupied by. My colleague Helen Beetham, I think, has argued me out of this to a certain extent over the last year or two. Just because I think there's a degree of naivety about the argument I was making in the book. And so I still think we have more agency in relation to digital technologies than a lot of social theory tends to imagine. But I think when that takes place in workplaces, it's a slightly different situation because we have the agency of the user, but we have the restrictions of the agency entailed by being a worker. And I don't think I was giving enough credence to the way in which the occupational role limits what you can do. So, the hill I die on is that you can use LLMs, at least while they're still not really enshittified, in creative and thoughtful ways. You can use them to go deeper into ideas. You can use them to really pull apart your ideas and test them. The idea that everyone is just going to be plagued by sycophancy and no longer know what's good and bad, it just isn't true. I mean, just ask an LLM, like a contemporary frontier model, to offer the best critique it can of a piece of writing. And it can be genuinely quite devastating. But I love that process because you ask it to critique your writing and then you think about the critique and you answer back. And I feel like I'm doing the best work of my life intellectually And a large part is that I'm using them in this deliberative, engaged way on a regular basis. The ideas feel very alive to me because it offers new ways of working with them. The problem is that this doesn't save time. And I think if we think about the crisis in higher education in 2025 and 2026, the key thing is that we're pressed for time. And so a thought experiment I keep playing with is imagine, counterfactually, this technology had been released at a time when the sector was healthier. I think we would have been better placed to deal with it. Because when people are leaving and not being replaced, when there are job losses, when student numbers are being pushed where we can still recruit, it creates a situation in which we're asked to do more with less. And there's understandable fear about future employment prospects given the state of the job market. And I think that means most academics will approach LLMs through the sign of anxiety and out of a desire to make a difficult working life slightly more tractable. And certain patterns of use will flow from that. I mean, it's a bit of a platitude, but in some ways, like, don't blame blame the bureaucracy as much as the technology. Like, it's something the LLM can be used for, but it's being incited for that sort of use by the situations we are working within. So I think this agency is possible, but it's more limited than I thought when reading the book. I still don't think that the basic proposition in generative AI for academics is one that we need. It's just not sufficient. We need to develop standards about what are appropriate and inappropriate uses, what's okay, what's not okay. Because I think if we're just individually using them in this slightly chaotic, urgent way, in some cases, literally to cope with work, that's a private matter. We're not talking about it, we're not reflecting on it. That is going to create a really negative user culture that brings out the worst facets of what the technology can do in higher education. So, I still think we should be trying to recover those conversations. I just think we have to be realistic about the political economy of the sector. The most salient fact for understanding technology in higher education in 2026 is the financial crisis in the sector. And until the funding settlement for higher education is reopened, that financial crisis is going to get worse. And LLMs are bound up with that in really complex ways. I've always liked Shannon Valor, the philosopher of technology's point, that AI is like a mirror to society. And I think we see all the things that were struggling and all the things that honestly were already pretty broken in higher education as a result of the possibilities of LLMs. But those things also get worse in the process.
Yeah, it's so true. I feel like it's interesting how you said you're doing some of your best work intellectually right now, and when you think about moving the conversation on to students, where most of the funding does come from for universities, that's not an approach that I've heard anyone advocate. I think you know it's perhaps the most pressing question right now. What do we do about students cheating with AI? And I know this is like a subject from the more recent article that you published in Learning, Media and Technology. I'll pop a link to that in the chat at some point. But and there's so much we could talk about that because I think you did an experiment, right, with some academic staff to see if they could determine the difference between an AI generated essay and not. But yeah, maybe that's a question for later. Because to stick with my main question, um, what I liked about the study was uh, the explanation for why devising new rules of conduct at like university-wide level just isn't really going to be the full solution. I feel like a lot of people I talk to are kind of just waiting for the university to provide some crystal clear rules on what is and isn't acceptable use, and that'll sort everything out. But as you talk about in that study, LLMs are so dynamic. They allow for various ways of interacting with information and producing knowledge. And it's kind of difficult to distinguish what drafting is versus what editing is, and thinking and discussing to the point where, I don't think people even realize when they're using or how much they use AI. Even Googling something right now produces AI results. And yeah, so I think what all of this is to say is that it's kind of getting difficult to devise rules that make crystal clear what is and what isn't acceptable use across different contexts, which the university has to do. And so what you call for in the article is for relational reflexivity, a potential way forward where we establish these spaces for collective reflection and dialogue between students and teachers, as well as between teachers. So Can you tell us about what about that and what would that look like in practice? What would relational reflexivity look like in practice?
Yeah, so relational reflexivity is an idea from Italian relational sociology, particularly the work of Pier Paolo Donati, and it treats the relation as an emergent element of society that is irreducible to the action of individuals. So when you have a kind of history and a of past interaction and expectation of future interaction, that there are qualities to the connection between you that neither party can control. You know, if you lose trust in a relationship, you can't just bring it back, even if both parties want it. And we think that's a really useful frame for thinking about relationships between teachers and students, because they are relationally very complex and there's a lot of trust involved in it. And I think you can use that concept in a critical way to look at what I've talked about elsewhere as a crisis of trust in higher education. Like, I'd argue these problems are fundamentally ones of trust in a way that just isn't being dealt with seriously when we frame it as technical issues or, you know, kind of malpractice issues. Um, but it also offers a way of thinking reparatively about this. And one of the features that I found really striking was the fear of ignorance and like academic staff not wanting to talk about their own uncertainty, feeling cast by the students as needing to give them a concrete answer and not knowing what the answer should be. And you know, the policy environment in universities has made that even more pronounced because no one knows what the policy is in many places. And so rather than be able to answer the question concretely, you know, student, this is what you should do, people will, you know, vaguely refer to documents on the website and sigh in relief that, you know, they no longer have to answer the question. And I think that's really damaging when we pass things on to the bureaucracy like that. For trust to work in bureaucracies, which is inherently quite a difficult thing, the people who are engaged in face-to-face interaction need to be able to offer guidance, particularly when they're in a kind of mentoring teaching role. And so I think there's some hope in the fact that we are in similar situations. My experience has been that it's very difficult to broker honest conversations with students about this because they, without for quite justified reasons, have the assumption we're trying to catch them out. I think if you don't approach this tactfully, but when you do have those honest conversations, they're really valuable. I think students want guidance, students want clarity, students are anxious about this technology, they're anxious about their futures, they're anxious about their own learning. And I think there's a imaginary of student malpractice that has become very widespread amongst academics, which is both inaccurate but really harmful, that students are just trying to find the easiest way to get the outcome. Um, and this is a tool to do it. Like, firstly, it's completely uncharitable. Like, you know, we need to look at this sociologically rather than moralistically. If students are approaching the degree transactionally, we really need to ask why. And there are clearly structural inequalities that are going to give rise to that. The amount of paid work students do has increased precipitously. Most degree programs are designed as if students have no outside responsibilities. And I suspect in many cases, behind demonstrated malpractice, there will be a really intractable personal situation that we should have been addressing in the first place. But even beyond students who are using it in problematic ways, you know, the assumption is often that all students are using this to cheat. And there's just no evidence for that. Like the picture of student use is very multifaceted and complex. My worry is that if we don't get to grips with this, we don't build trust around it, and we don't offer clear guidance that is immediately actionable to students, the problematic uses will grow with time. And I think that's really worrying. But at the moment, students are often using this in really creative ways. They're using it in really destructive ways. And there's lots of really ambiguous cases in the middle that are very context dependent, both in terms of the discipline, the kind of task they're doing, but also where a student is in their journey. And so I think it's being framed in really problematic ways. I don't think cognitive outsourcing is a good concept, but I'm not sure what a better concept would be. But clearly, this is a key risk. Some of my colleagues talk about it as epistemic hazards, which I think is also a useful phrase. And so, you know, if you're learning to do something, outsourcing it before you've learned to do it is just obviously dangerous to learning. So there is a real issue here, but I think the frame many of us are imposing on it is really unhelpful. And in that research you mentioned, we did this experiment, which I really loved, in focus groups, where we had a student-generated essay, and we had student research partners. You generate a essay using ChatGPT entirely for the same question. And in focus groups, we asked colleagues to identify which was the AI generated essay and which was the student generated essay. And not only were people often wrong, they were really, really confident about it when they were wrong. And that stayed with me because, we can all see signs of superficial use of LLMs. Like, that's really obvious. But it worries me how many people assume that because they can see signs of polishing an essay using an LLM, that they necessarily can infer deeper structural generative use of it. And I just see no reason to assume that is justified. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong, but you can't read back the process of use in a straightforward way just by looking at the superficial style.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly seen a lot of that, almost to the point where I feel like some colleagues have got like a paranoia about how much it's being used, and yeah, I think um, it, I mean, just to go back to the point about having those open conversations, maybe it, they must be quite difficult to do then in that environment where there is this lack of trust that you're talking about. There's so just to maybe go back to that question again for a moment, is that um, I know you're trying to set up the AI Commons at the moment. So I just want to go back to that idea of trying to have these open, candid conversations and your experience of them so far. Like, what have been the main difficulties with trying to get people to just have these open conversations?
Well, I think the actual unit to have them in is in teaching teams. And so, like, until recently, I was leading a large PGC EdTech program with 150 students. And I thought we were really well placed to do this and like give a consistent message to students. And it's only when one of my colleagues did a PG Cert project about our views on AI that I started to realize that actually we were giving students completely conflicting advice. And if we're struggling as an EdTech team to have those conversations in a clear and consistent way with students, I assume most teaching teams are going to struggle with it because it's our subject matter and we can build it into the curriculum in a really organic way. And so consistency, I think, is key, but it's also time to do it. I mean, like our team meets in person together, like as a program team, twice a semester at the very most. And, we're all rushing through semester one, semester two. We have a 2 semester structure to, kind of stay on top of things. And if this was workloaded, if we had, time set aside for AI adjustment to find approaches that worked at a local level, this would be much easier than it is. But obviously, that's not going to happen because we're strained for resources. And, that's coming from a fairly robust university in resources term. So again, I think it comes back to the context for the sector. We need time and we need to be able to do this in our existing teams. I don't think, top-down policies are necessary to set what institutional rules and expectations are, but they have to be mediated at local levels. And that's really hard to do in in a kind of accelerated academy where workloads are increasing. So the AI Commons project is a kind of modest attempt to deal with that, which is thinking about how time constrained people are and just running it as an internal newsletter effectively. And so I'm collecting case studies from around the university of interesting practice. And so every 2 weeks, it's just a set of curated links, a prompt to think about, a short case study, and information about events taking place. And so we're organizing events associated with this, and we're also doing a student-led podcast to kind of give student voice associated. But the key thing is to make it manageable for people. And so the idea is that the baseline level of keeping up that I think honestly you do need to know in order to teach effectively in 2026, that at the very least you can do that if you just read the email every 2 weeks. But there are also paths for going forward. So you can come to events, you can go deeper into practices when your time allows, you can listen to the podcast. And crucially, to try and build networks between people across the institution, because there's a lot of creative responses taking place, but they tend to be very local. They tend to be very context specific. And at least at our university, the different faculties don't really talk very much. And so learning between humanities, biological sciences, medicine, and the kind of engineering faculty, I think, is really important. But yeah, it's very modest because honestly, I think the way you solve this problem is every member of academic teaching staff, individually and in teams, at some point in the next year or two, needs to reflect at length about what they teach, the assumptions they make about students, how they do delivery, and then practice any changes they want to make. And that's just not tenable. Like, we can't do that training. And so I think we need kind of more realistic training methods and capacity building methods in terms of the time available to us.
Yeah, and I guess like part of that training and part of the reflections, well, based on what you wrote in the paper, will probably include some reflections on inequality. And I want to make that like a final question because we're getting to the half hour mark now. But I think it's a really interesting claim from the paper, and I think it's something that's like overlooked a lot in these conversations. So I'm just going to read a quote. So you say, with large language models, it's a matter of the cultural capital, knowledge, experience, and skills, etc., which the user brings to the software as much as the proper or appropriate technique for using the software. For example, LLMs will tend to match any specialized vocabulary from the user input in their responses because they infer user expectations from such input. This means that expert users can unlock functionality which those with less cultural capital will be unable to access. I feel like that kind of cultural capital element of how people from different positions, different backgrounds will get different things out of their interactions with AI is being completely overlooked, at least when I've been reading through a lot of the literature. And you also written in a recent blog about uh, AI leading to a deepening of inequalities between universities as well. So not just between groups of students, but perhaps between universities. So yeah, as my final question, I just wanted to ask, how do you see AI impacting on these inequalities in higher education?
Yeah, I mean, in so many ways. If anyone wants to talk about cultural capital in this, I'm really keen to explore it and haven't really had time. I mean, just speaking from a kind of STS perspective on the experience of being an end user, the more fluent and expansive your vocabulary is, the more easily and comfortably you write improvisationally. Literally, the more capacity you unlock in the LLM. And we've got decades of sociology of education literature on cultural capital to make sense of what that's likely to mean for existing inequalities. It means expert use is fundamentally different to non-expert use, as my colleague Helen Beetham talks about as the paradox of expertise. And it means that your kind of fluency makes a difference. Like one of the reasons that I've stepped back a bit from some of the more optimistic arguments in the guidebook is because like various colleagues and friends like gently pointed out to me that I was fairly atypical because I'd been blogging for 20 years. And I think that's why, I got really confused in the first couple of years. People were saying, this stuff is useless, like it's all hype. And I just didn't understand. Well, no, it's not useless. It's amazing. Like the quality of material I'm getting from it is mind-blowing. Like I would argue that Claude Opus 4.6, if prompted effectively, can write at the level of or above the level of most academics. And I think that's a really challenging, difficult thing to sit with. But that's only if you're prompting it as an academic. So if you're giving it complex work, it will respond with complexity. And I mean, it also quite literally lets you violate safeguards if you claim expertise, which I think is a really interesting issue here. That it will sometimes say, no, I don't think I should do that. And if you say, I'm an academic at a research university, it will often say, oh, okay, then that's fine. Like, let's go ahead. And so, it responds to symbolic capital as well. Or I'm not sure if that's using the concept accurately. It responds to claims of authority as well. And I think part of that is the symbolic universe your vocabulary places you within. The key to using LLMs effectively is to facilitate them attuning to what you're trying to get out of the interaction. And it's not just the individual words you use, it's the pattern of the words that the LLM uses to identify the range of the response that would be useful to you. And so if you are able to write in a way that secretes these clues about what kind of conversation you're trying to have, it can attune very quickly. And if you work across disciplines, as I do, if you work across registers, so sometimes you're doing social ontology, sometimes you're doing university policy, sometimes you're doing kind of pedagogy, it's very useful because you can have really different types of conversations with it. But the capacity to elicit that is just not evenly distributed. There's also the capabilities of the advanced models. Every 6 months or so, I sign up to the £200 a month ChatGPT subscription just to see how it's changed. And what you can do with ChatGPT Pro 5.4 extended thinking is really astonishing. The reporting function will now literally look at thousands and thousands of sources. And we know most people aren't subscribing to even the kind of core subscription version. And so very few of our students are subscribing to Pro, but I'm guessing some of them will be. And it's effectively like having a team of research assistants available to you 24/7. You can't straightforwardly trust what it produces, you have to check it. But the breadth of things you can cover is amazing. And so, access is another point as well. But inequality should be at the heart of how we discuss this. But to do that, we need good concepts for thinking about it. And I think one of the reasons we struggle in higher education is we don't yet have accurate or adequate concepts for talking about these changes. We keep trying to shoehorn them into our existing vocabularies. And at this stage, 3.5 years since ChatGPT launched, I just don't think that works. And I just don't think it's ever going to work. We need new concepts for thinking about this.
Yeah, it's interesting the different uh, levels at which people might use one of these AI models and how it kind of just replicates that older issue of how more affluent students might have been able to pay someone else in another country to write their essays. It's just like it's not really a new problem. I'm going to run through some of the questions in the chat box because and then maybe ask people to use the raise hand function. But Emma's question, I don't know if you've seen it, asks about this kind of coincident or coinciding rise of the use of AI with the post-pandemic kind of context. And I know post-pandemic university is something you've kind of talked about before as well. Like, how do you see this as like AI is being sort of sought as a solution to a lot of these problems that have kind of arisen in a coincidence kind of way? If I'm hopefully not butchering Emma's question.
Oh yeah, completely. I mean, I could talk about this all day. Just biographically, I finished a project on the post-pandemic university a month before ChatGPT was released. And I was literally asking myself, well, what should I focus on now? Like, I feel like I need a new topic. Like, I've done the pandemic thing to death. I don't want to talk about it anymore. And then this came along. And so just for me, the two things were connected. But if you think about November 2022, it was the point at which UK universities were starting to return to some kind of pre-pandemic normality. To be clear, I think COVID was still a live issue in ways society was deliberately repressing. But the facets of normal life were beginning to return. And I think that really shaped how people have responded to it on a kind of psychodynamic level. Obviously, there were many things happening during the pandemic, but the professional change was that we had the biggest shift in our digital activity as professionals that we've ever had. It was imposed on us, and it was done so against the crisis of existential anxiety. And I think a bit of that seeped into how people have responded to ChatGPT. Is that like, oh God, we don't want to have another change imposed on us. We want things, we just want some normality. Is it too much to ask that we have some period where things go back to normal for a bit so we can settle? Yeah, I do think that really shaped things. And the move to the particularly disorganized kind of hybrid work we have in universities has also made it more difficult to develop collegial solutions to this problem. When we just see each other face to face less, when face to face interaction is something we have to schedule in advance. I spent a conference in London on Tuesday talking exclusively to people from Manchester because we so rarely see each other face to face. And I think that's become a common experience. And there's lots of small scale forms of learning and coordination that took place in kind of pre-pandemic universities. So I think that's made it worse. And also, I think it's changed the economics of the sector in some quite fundamental ways. And yeah, I agree. I think the pandemic is the context to understand the impact of generative AI. And we've got a longer story here. So one of the things I get frustrated about is telling the story of generative AI in higher education as if it started in 2023. this is, from my point of view, the culmination of like a 10-year process of platformization in higher education, where it's now got to the point where it's changing every aspect of the university. And we need to understand how we got here in order to understand the pathways available to us in the future.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I guess also people's personal lives during the pandemic, obviously being unable to socialize as much, probably created that demand for what people are now using a lot of these large language models for, which is like a friend. Like if you like a lot of people in their everyday life are like, orientating themselves to these technologies as a kind of like someone who can help them through dilemmas, like personal dilemmas, and I guess you see that panning out in higher education as well, really, when people are talking about the potential introduction of chatbots on a pastoral kind of level to help with some of the like mental health aspects of going through university. But I want to try and just stick to some of the questions from other people first. So Kevin in the chat box also mentioned cognitive stunting, which I think is much more appropriate. He says to describe the issues that students are encountering with generative AI. Is that a term you've come across? I haven't actually come across that.
Yeah, I'm nervous about it, to be honest. My problem with cognitive outsourcing is not the outsourcing, it's the cognitive, because I think it implies a misleading model of how learning happens. And my concern about stunting is that it seems to imply there's a linear trajectory that is interrupted by this. And I think we need a concept that can open up the complexity of this. I'm training as a psychotherapist part-time as part of my potential escape plan from academia. And so I've got the kind of fixation that someone does in this sort of training. But like for a psychoanalytical lens, learning is not a cognitive process. Learning is a process that has cognitive elements. And if we're trying to understand the developmental impacts of LLMs, I think we have to speak to that complexity of what learning is. Like I'm very interested in intuition, for example, and the kinds of learning that take place when you stop thinking about it and you go off and do something else. And so I think there are risks through that lens that cognitive outsourcing doesn't capture. One of the metrics that I think we really need to know is like time on device for people using these. I'm really worried about students using LLMs on smartphones because my intuition would be that the time on the app is going to get much more expanded on a smartphone. And so a lot of the slightly moral panicky literature about social media and the end of boredom, I think some of those real concerns apply to LLMs as well. So I find myself using cognitive outsourcing all the time because it's such a ready-to-hand way of explaining the concern. But I feel like it's such a multi-dimensional challenge that we need to find a concept that speaks to that complexity.
Yeah. I want to open up to the floor. Is anyone waiting to ask a question and they might want to raise their hand using that hand function? Um, I mean, there's an obvious sort of elephant in the room question that we haven't really approached yet, which is always one that comes up in these forums, which is about the ethics of using AI at all. Whether it's stuff we've discussed already, like the kind of plagiarism, intellectual property, impact on critical thinking, but also things that come up around its energy consumption, its connections to big tech platforms, the collaboration with police, and even some of these recent military war crimes with some of these major AI firms, the bias and discrimination, etc., etc. Right? There's loads of these issues around the ethics of using AI, and I know from a lot of the writing that you've done, it's something that you are constantly sort of grappling with. So what's your latest thinking on that, like the ethics of using these tools in the first place?
Yeah, I mean,
Big
I
question.
can answer about that. And so like I was saying earlier about signing up to ChatGPT 5.4 Pro, and I'm just throwing stuff into it to see how it works. And I'm conscious that I'm telling myself, oh, I'm doing user-facing research about this, so I need to know. And that is true, but part of me also enjoys it, and I'm really uncomfortable with the fact that I enjoy it. I mean, in terms of energy use, what worries me is not energy use now, it's energy use 2 or 3 years from now. Like my understanding is the science is still relatively contested, but as a percentage of data center energy use, compared to say streaming video, like it's not the largest use by any means, but I think we could very easily sleepwalk into a situation where we normalize its use across a really wide range of activities. And if user growth continues on a similar scale, then I think it could clearly be an absolute catastrophe. And I think the politics of the data center build out and the energy politics of how the data centers are powered is something much more immediate as well, that is tied up in issues of national and international justice in quite complex ways. And in that sense, I think we are implicated in it to the extent that we're using it. But I think we need to see this in terms of platform capitalism as a whole. In the book that Milan Sturmer and I are just about to finish, we argue that we have to reframe LLMs in terms of a longer history of platform capitalism. This is not the start of something new. This is something existing, reaching its really dark crescendo. And we need a politics that speaks to that. And I think individual ethics has to be part of that, about what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. But we need to think about the politics and regulation surrounding it. And I don't know what an agenda like that should look like. And I'm hoping other people will start to have creative ideas about that, because I think we're moving into quite a dark situation. The other thing is the psychological health impacts of it. I I think the current models are actually quite innocuous on that level, but they're not going to be, because when the bubble bursts or when the AI labs go to IPO, they're gonna start trying to shitify these models, to use Cory Doctorow's term. And if we're seeing significant psychological harms at this point, when they are beginning to be designed to be proactively addictive and sticky and manipulative, I think that could really spread. And so I also worry about that, and I worry about my own work inadvertently normalizing that, even as I'm saying that I'm really worried about it. Um, so yeah, that might give a sense of the fact that I'm all over the place on this, but it's something that I actively think about.
Yeah, I saw a quote from Sam Altman recently. He said, "We see a future where intelligence is a utility like electricity or water, and people buy it from us on a meter." I just,
Greek, right?
I know. Sometimes I let the mask slip a little bit. But right, we've got some questions. So, Sharon, I don't know if you want to turn your camera and mic on.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. I really loved this talk because I think along very much the same lines when it comes to technology in general. And that's where my question comes, because you're talking about your worries about, advocating or anyway trying to say, okay, it's here, it's gonna grow, let's use it wisely, let's think about it. And that's exactly what I used to do when it came to social media. When I arrived here in 2012, someone, and I to this day don't know who, left a book in my letterbox here at uni that says why you should delete your social media account now. And it was an interesting provocation, obviously, because I was one of those that was saying, well, okay, it will have its uses. And certainly it does to an extent, but I do see now on social media that the landscape is dark, is really dark, especially on Facebook and stuff like that. So we see the agency of people trying to join different forms. But my question is, I have the guilt, how can we prevent, or what can we do to avoid having the same guilt when it comes to AI?
Yeah, I mean, that's an issue close to my heart. I wrote a guidebook for social media in 2016 called Social Media for Academics. And in 2026, I think this morning was the first time I posted on social media for a year. And I've largely removed myself from these platforms. And so that's why, in some ways, like I regret bits of the Generative AI for Academics book, because that instinct was familiar that this is potentially harmful. You can use it in positive ways. So I'm going to do an autoethnography, work out how to use it positively, and then try and talk people through it in the hope they'll use it in better rather than worse ways. But social media for me is a real cautionary tale. I do think part of it is what AI criticism can learn from social media criticism. Because the early social media critics were right about the long-term destination, but I think they were wrong about how we were going to get there. And I wonder if the biggest issue in a lot of that early social media criticism was an inability to account for the pleasure people were taking in the platforms. And it was quite moralized, at least the stuff that I've cited in my books from the time, it was quite moralizing and dismissive at parts, quite openly. And then people, including myself, kind of added to that lot of Luddite, kind of, oh, you're just being Luddites reaction. And it was a really unhelpful debate. And so the instinct I do have quite strongly is that AI criticism needs to start from a sociological recognition of the motivations people have for using LLMs and also the pleasures and satisfactions that they take in that use. And then we need to talk with them on that level. And when I hopefully qualify in my psychotherapeutic work, that's the kind of approach I want to take to clinical work, because I'm very interested in, I don't think addiction is the right metaphor, but I think there are intense forms of dependence people are beginning to develop on LLMs that really worry me. And I think just telling those people LLMs are bad literally does nothing to help them. And I think we need ways of thinking about these issues that grapple with the complexity of them. Like you said earlier, Tom, about kind of post-pandemic loneliness. And I think that's clearly an issue that leads people to rely on models. And we need ways of talking about that. And so, I think the kind of Luddite strand of AI criticism has lots of political value. It has some analytical value, although I have questions about aspects of it. But I just don't think it's scalable. I think we need AI criticism beyond Ludditism. And I think that's fundamentally quite hard to do in this landscape. But yeah, thank you. Like the social media question is one I think about most often, because I think I probably did as much as anyone to encourage academics in the UK to use social media. And now I would encourage any academic who can to stop using social media. And so I'd maybe run the same course with generative AI, just on a much shorter timescale.
Yeah, great comparison. So yeah, we've still got a bit of time. Kevin?
Turn myself on. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. This is a really great talk. Really appreciate you coming to talk to us here. I've got a million questions, but I'm trying to kind of formulate one decent one. The thing that's kind of going through my head a lot at the moment, and has done for a while, is not just how do we deal with the now, it's how we deal with the future of this. So I work in learning and teaching enhancement, and we're very much focused on like, right, how do we get people to engage, to critically think, to upskill themselves and their students about what's going on right now. But equally, and this is where it gets really difficult. It's like, okay, well, these students are going to graduate in maybe 2 years' time, or 3 years' time, or 1 year's time. And who knows what it's going to be like in 2 years' time. We're on a path right now where it just seems to be accepted, not by everybody, but certainly in a mainstream context, that this is just going to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. But that's not predetermined. There's very much a lot of conversations around economic bubbles, like models collapsing, LLMs being untenable, and then it's splintering off into a whole different types of generative AI technologies. So my question basically is, this is so head-batteringly complex of what might happen. How do we prepare people for that? Say in 2 years' time, it's so hard to fathom what might happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be cautious when some employers say that they want prompting skills because they might think they want that now, but I'm not convinced that's actually what will matter to them in 3 or 4 years' time. I think we have to lean into this with students in a major way and talk to them about the uncertainty. I think just AI literacy that equips them to understand the landscape of development and to have ways of talking about this that even if it's not able to talk about necessarily what will happen in future, it can help them think about the changes and how to evaluate them. Because we are too prone in the sector to think LLM equals chatbot. And the book Milan and I have coming out argues that the chatbot is going to be a vanishing mediator, that the chatbot is turning into something else over the next few years. And other forms of LLM are going to be much more influential in terms of shaping this landscape. So enterprise level systems, like Copilot, the take-up has been relatively low so far, but I think they're likely to grow. Most of Anthropic's profitability, to the extent they have it, is coming from enterprise AI. And so I do believe this stuff might be built into the working environment. I just think it will look very different. There's also a small but real chance, like this is all going to go away. And I feel slightly stupid saying that, but the further I've got into, with the caveat that I'm not trained as a political economist, so I'm very much an amateur in this. But the further I've gone into trying to understand the commercial foundations of the industry, the more I think it is a real possibility that you might not be able to offer these products at scale in a commercially viable way. And if we're moving into an environment where energy volatility is going to increase, the data center infrastructure is insulated from that to some extent by long-term contracts. But if that volatility is going to be a recurrent feature of the environment, and my understanding is some economists say it will be, those contracts are going to have to be renewed at some point. And at the moment, the firms are just burning investors' capital. And so what happens when that's no longer viable? And so I don't think LLMs will go away, but I think mass consumer-facing LLMs possibly could go away, which should certainly make everyone's life a lot easier in a lot of ways. But yeah, it is uncertain. And, I feel bad criticizing the Wonky conference at the start of this talk because, it's very hard to talk concretely about this while recognizing what we don't know. And so it's easy for me to make that criticism, but I do think as a sector we can do better. And there's a tendency to just say, oh, it's all changing so quickly, then we throw up our hands and don't try and analyze those changes. There are certain things that we can reasonably predict. Current pricing models are temporary. They're a product of lots of capital flooding into the industry. The services are going to change as pricing models change. Coding agents, which I really wanted to believe was just another hype wave, I think that's possibly where the real productivity gains for the economy are going to come. And the implications of those are incredibly complex, and we need to understand that. So while we can't know, there are things we can say meaningfully. I'm doing a futures workshop with my friend Richard Sanford at Manchester in a few weeks, where we're trying to just use basic foresight methods to try and map out some of these things. Because we can't know, but we can talk meaningfully about the tendencies we see and how they might interact over time. Because if we just imagine that the future will be like the present, just with more powerful chatbots, we are going to mislead students. We're going to spend a lot of time and energy doing stuff that might not pay off. And so we do need to get better at this. And those are some vague ideas about how we might, but it's really, really complex. But we shouldn't give up in the face of that.
Yeah, brilliant answer. We've maybe got time for one more we can squeeze in. Whilst we've still got Mark for 3 minutes. Don't know if anyone's no one's got the hand up, but it's like the idea that it could go away. I mean, we're in a week now where I think metaverse and Meta's a big project for, I think it's called Horizon something. It's completely started to wind down now. And they put so much money into that. They also put so much money into Libra, which was a cryptocurrency that was going to be used across the metaverse and the meta platforms. That's just kind of gone away quietly as well. So it does happen, doesn't it? Even when billions of dollars get invested in.
Well, are there any economists in the room? I've been spending the last 2 weeks trying to understand what the impact on of the Iran war on this is going to be. So if there's a sustained conflict, uh, because like the data center build out like is going to be really vulnerable to supply constraints. And if this goes on for a few months, if we're in a situation where there's like petrol rationing, it's going to be impossible for AI labs to justify this. So I'm completely out of my depth with thinking about that. But the economics of the industry and how current geopolitical volatility are going to shape it, I think is such an important question. So yeah, I'm always slightly anxious saying it might all go away because it sounds ridiculous, but I do feel like there's a small chance it might all go away in the next 6 months. But we'll be in World War III, so maybe that won't be something to celebrate, to say the least. But yeah, seriously, if anyone is an economist or knows economists working on this, I'd love to talk to them because unless I've misunderstood something significant, which I might have, I do think the impact of what's going on in the Middle East now could be huge on this industry.
Yeah, Daniela.
Thanks so much, Mark. I really enjoyed this talk and this conversation. I just wanted to quickly talk about economics, just briefly. I was trained as an economist, although that's not how I work. Just wanted to draw your attention, everyone's attention, to the works of two economists that I think are relevant in this regard, though not specifically in relation to Iran, the Iran war. But I've also put in the chat Darren Acemoglu is probably one of the most acclaimed economists currently working, an economist at MIT, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, and he's done some work on the projected productivity increases associated with AI. As I put in the chat, the too long didn't read version is that they're not insignificant, but negligible. This is work that's conveniently being sidelined by all the major corporations, also not really reported in the media. Just although, he's a Nobel Prize winner, so he could command some attention, but it doesn't. Wonder why. And then the other economist that I would like to, whose work I would like to highlight is Maximilian Cassi. He's based at Oxford University, also a smaller, insignificant institution. He wrote a book that's called The Means of Prediction, which I think is a really, really compelling book and a really interesting economic analysis of what these companies are doing. And I think I just want to sort of end on this, that I think, your talk was so informative and I think so helpful. And this whole conversation has been so helpful. I think that what's really not happening right now is the distinction between the technologies and the commercially available tools. Because I think that the technologies have a lot of promise, but the way that they're being commercialized, whether it's Claude, whether it's ChatGPT, whether it's Microsoft Copilot, they are those commercializations are just vulnerable to critiques left and right. But that is not the same as the technology. Using a locally trained LLM is something completely different. And I just don't think we are talking about that enough. So anyway, thanks very much. I hope that these resources might be helpful to folks.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that last point, and that feels like a really good point to end on. That it's not exhausted by the commercial development application of this, and there are other possibilities. And yeah, thank you for the recommendations. I had the Nobel Prize winner's book. I actually just got it a few days ago, and so it's on my pile. But I'd not heard of the second person. Could you put their name in the chat? Yeah, fantastic. Because yeah, I'd love to read that. And yeah, yes, thank you everyone. This was a really nice conversation, and I hope I didn't seem too vague. I just came away from this event earlier on this week thinking that we all need to talk more about what we don't know about this and all the things that are uncertain and all the things that are complex. Because there's too many people kind of making fast pronouncements about this to kind of fit it into a convenient narrative, and it is all really uncertain. It's fascinating, but also a lot hinges on getting this right for higher education, but also wider society.
Oh yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for your amazing questions, the discussion, and thanks so much, Mark, for coming. It's been truly fascinating discussion, and yeah, whilst I've still got everyone, next week, Daniela will be our special guest. So if you want to come along and continue those conversations, that'd be great. But yeah, thanks again, Mark, and yeah, thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thanks everyone.